Sacramento, California, July 17, 1984. Dawn breaks over Highway 80 near Squaw Creek outside Truckee. A motorist notices something on the side of the road, smoke rising from what looks like trash bags. He slows down, gets closer, and realizes it's not trash. It's a body, still smoldering, burned beyond recognition. The police arrive. They photograph the scene, document the evidence, but they can't identify the victim. The body is too badly burned. They can't tell if it's male or female, how old they were, who they were. The coroner labels the remains Jane Doe number 4873, another unsolved case, another nameless victim, and the file goes cold. What they didn't know was that her name was Theresa Knorr. She was 17 years old. She had spent the last 2 years of her life handcuffed under a dining room table. Her own mother had allowed her to be shot, had the bullet carved out of her back with a box cutter, and left the wound to fester for months. And when Suesan became too sick, too delirious, too much of a liability, her mother decided she had to disappear. So she ordered her sons to drive Suesan to a remote highway, douse her in gasoline, and set her on fire. A coroner's examination would later reveal that Suesan was still alive when they lit the match. This is the story of Theresa Knorr, a mother who tortured and murdered 2 of her own daughters, who ruled her family with terror for over a decade, who forced her children to participate in unspeakable crimes, and who nearly got away with it. This is the real story of the Theresa Knorr house. What they didn't tell you about America's most evil mother. Theresa Jimmy Francine Cross was born on March 14, 1946, in California. Her childhood was marked by instability, abuse, poverty. By the time she was 18, she was already married to her first husband, Clifford Sanders. They had a son together, Howard, but the marriage was violent. Theresa claimed Clifford abused her, beat her, terrorized her. Then, in 1964, when Theresa was just 18 years old, she shot and killed Clifford Sanders. She told police it was self-defense, that he had attacked her, that she had no choice. A jury believed her. She was acquitted. Clifford's family insisted it was murder, but the verdict stood, and Theresa walked free. Over the next 2 decades, Theresa would marry and divorce 3 more times. She had 6 children in total. Howard from her first marriage, Robert and William from her second marriage to Robert Noir Sr., then Suesan, Sheila, and Terry from later relationships. By the early 1980s, Theresa was a single mother living in Sacramento with all 6 of her children. They moved frequently, cheap apartments, run-down neighborhoods, each place dirtier and more isolated than the last. Neighbors who lived near the Noir family during this time would later describe the conditions as disturbing. The apartment was filthy. It smelled of urine and decay. The children were never allowed outside. They never played with other kids. They rarely attended school. When neighbors did see them, they looked scared, nervous, tense, malnourished. But no one called the authorities. No one intervened. And behind closed doors, Theresa's reign of terror continued. She beat her children constantly, with her fists, with belts, with whatever object was nearby. She threw knives and scissors at them, embedding blades into walls just inches from their heads. She forced them to eat until they vomited. She handcuffed them under the dining room table for days at a time, letting them out only to use the bathroom. She pointed a loaded gun at their heads, threatening to pull the trigger if they disobeyed. But as her daughters grew older, as they entered their teenage years and began to develop into young women, Theresa's abuse took on a new dimension: jealousy. She watched Suesan and Sheila blossom into beautiful girls, and something inside her twisted with rage. She accused them of trying to seduce men, of being promiscuous. According to some accounts, she even forced them into prostitution to bring money into the family, and the punishments became more severe, more sadistic, more personal. Suesan was the first to bear the full weight of her mother's madness. By 1982, Theresa Knorr was 15 years old. She was quiet, obedient, terrified of her mother. She tried to stay invisible, to avoid Theresa's wrath. But it didn't matter. Theresa had decided that Suesan was the problem, that she was ungrateful, rebellious, a threat. And so the torture began. Theresa handcuffed Suesan under the dining room table. Not for hours, not for days, but for nearly 2 years. Suesan was forced to sleep on the floor beneath the table, her wrists chained to the legs. Theresa would feed her occasionally, scooping food into her mouth by hand like an animal. She forced a gag into Suesan's mouth to keep her quiet. Suesan begged to be released. She cried. She pleaded. Theresa ignored her. The other children watched in silence, too terrified to intervene. Then, in June of 1983, something happened that would change everything. During one of Theresa's rampages, she decided to temporarily uncuff Suesan. But she handed a loaded gun to Terry, her youngest daughter, who was only 13 years old at the time, and ordered her to point it at Suesan and shoot if she moved. Theresa and the other children went into the kitchen to prepare oatmeal. While they were there, someone dropped a spoon. The noise startled Terry. Her finger squeezed the trigger. The gun fired. The bullet tore through Suesan's chest and lodged deep in her back. Suesan screamed. Blood poured from the wound. But Theresa didn't call an ambulance. She didn't take Suesan to the hospital. She rechained Suesan under the table and was only upset that the blood had stained her carpet. For the next year, Suesan remained chained with a bullet lodged in her back, the wound festering, untreated. About a year later, in 1984, Suesan announced she wanted to leave. She couldn't take the abuse anymore. She wanted out. Theresa agreed, under one condition: the bullet had to come out first. She was afraid it could be used as evidence. If Suesan went to a hospital, doctors would ask questions. Police would get involved. On the kitchen floor, Theresa forced Suesan to drink half a bottle of liquor and gave her Mellaril capsules, an antipsychotic medication, to sedate her. Then, according to some accounts, Theresa ordered her son Robert to remove the bullet using a box cutter and kitchen knife. Suesan was semi-conscious, moaning in pain as they carved into her back. The makeshift surgery was brutal. Eventually, they dislodged the bullet, but the wound didn't heal. It became infected. Sepsis spread through Suesan's body. Over the following weeks, she grew weaker, delirious. Her skin turned yellow from jaundice, and Theresa did nothing. By July of 1984, Suesan was barely conscious. She lay under the dining room table, chained, feverish, moaning in pain. Theresa knew Suesan was dying, and she knew that a dead daughter would bring questions, investigators, accusations. So she made a decision. Suesan had to disappear. Permanently. July 16, 1984. Theresa called her sons, Robert and William, into the living room. She told them they were going on a drive, that they had to get rid of something. The boys knew better than to ask questions. They had learned long ago that disobedience meant violence. So they nodded, and they waited. Theresa went to Suesan's side. She unchained her wrists. Suesan could barely stand. Her legs buckled. Theresa tied rope around Suesan's arms and legs, binding them tight. She took duct tape and covered Suesan's mouth, sealing it shut. Then she ordered Robert and William to carry their sister to the car. They placed Suesan in the back seat. She was still breathing, still alive, but too weak to fight. Theresa gathered all of Suesan's belongings, clothes, shoes, personal items. She stuffed everything into black garbage bags. Then she threw the bags into the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat. Robert and William sat in the back with Suesan's bound body between them, and they drove. They headed east out of Sacramento, toward the Sierra Nevada mountains. The drive took over an hour. No one spoke. Suesan drifted in and out of consciousness, her breathing shallow, her body limp. Finally, Theresa pulled off Interstate 80 near Squaw Creek in a remote area outside Truckee. She parked the car, looked around. There was no one in sight. She ordered the boys to take Suesan out of the car. They carried her to the side of the road and laid her down on top of the garbage bags. Suesan's eyes were half open. Robert thought she was already dead, but Theresa knew she wasn't, and she didn't care. She handed Robert a container of gasoline and told him to pour it over everything, over Suesan, over the bags, over all the evidence. Robert hesitated, but he didn't ask questions. He just did what his mother told him. He poured the gasoline. The smell filled the air. Then Theresa handed him a lighter, and she told him to set it on fire. Robert struck the lighter, touched the flame to the gasoline-soaked bags, and everything ignited. Flames erupted. Smoke billowed into the sky, and Theresa Knorr, 17 years old, bound and gagged, burned on the side of Highway 80. Theresa watched for a moment. Then she got back in the car, ordered the boys to follow, and drove away. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Suesan's body was discovered, still smoldering, unrecognizable. A coroner's examination would later reveal stab wounds in her back and confirm that she had been alive when the fire was lit. Jane Doe, 4873. The police had no idea who she was, and Theresa went home, confident she had gotten away with murder. 1 year passed. Theresa convinced herself she was untouchable. She had killed her daughter, disposed of the body, and no one had come asking questions. No police, no investigators, nothing. So when her paranoia and rage turned toward another daughter, she didn't hesitate. Sheila Gay Sanders was 20 years old in 1985. She was one of Theresa's older daughters, and according to some accounts, Theresa had previously forced Sheila into prostitution along with Suesan. But by mid-1985, Theresa's delusions had intensified. She accused Sheila of contracting a sexually transmitted disease and transmitting it to Theresa through a toilet seat. The accusation was medically impossible, but Theresa believed it, and her rage grew. She began beating Sheila more frequently, accusing her of being pregnant, demanding she confess. Sheila denied it. She swore she wasn't pregnant, that she hadn't done anything wrong, but Theresa didn't believe her, and so she decided Sheila needed to be punished. June 18, 1985. Theresa dragged Sheila to a small broom closet in the apartment. She shoved her inside, locked the door, and left her there. Sheila pounded on the door, screamed to be let out. Theresa ignored her. She told the other children that Sheila would stay in the closet until she confessed. For 3 days, Sheila remained locked inside that closet. No food, no water. The space was barely big enough to sit down. Sheila begged. She cried. She confessed to being pregnant, hoping it would end the torture. But Theresa still refused to let her out. She didn't believe the confession. She thought Sheila was lying. So she left her there, hour after hour, day after day, until Sheila's voice grew weak, until she stopped pounding on the door, until she stopped making any sound at all. On June 21, 1985, Sheila Sanders died inside that closet. She was 20 years old. The cause of death was dehydration and starvation. She had been locked inside for 3 days with no food, no water, no way to escape. And Theresa left her body there for 3 more days. As decomposition set in, the smell of death filled the apartment. Neighbors complained about the odor. Theresa told them it was a dead animal in the walls. But she knew she couldn't leave Sheila's body there forever. Eventually, someone would figure it out. So once again, Theresa called her sons. Theresa ordered Robert and William to remove Sheila's body from the closet. By this point, decomposition had already begun. The smell was overwhelming. The boys could barely breathe, but they did what their mother commanded. They pulled Sheila's body out, placed it inside a large cardboard box, and carried it to the car. Theresa drove them north, toward the Truckee Tahoe area. She found a remote spot near the Truckee Tahoe airport and told the boys to leave the box there. They placed Sheila's body on the ground, got back in the car, and drove away. Within hours, the body was discovered. Police opened the box, found the remains of a young woman, but like Suesan, Sheila couldn't be identified. She became Jane Doe, 660785. Another cold case. Another nameless victim. Theresa returned home. She cleaned the closet, scrubbed the floors, tried to eliminate any evidence of what had happened. But the smell lingered. The stain remained. And Theresa knew that eventually, someone might start asking questions. September 29, 1986. More than a year had passed since Sheila's death, but the closet where she died still smelled of decay. Theresa scrubbed it repeatedly, used bleach, vinegar, air fresheners, but nothing worked. The smell had seeped into the wood, into the subfloor, into the walls, and Theresa became increasingly paranoid. She convinced herself that the police would eventually search the apartment, find the evidence, link her to the murders. So she came up with a plan. If she couldn't remove the evidence, she would destroy it. She would burn down the entire apartment. But Theresa didn't want to do it herself. She didn't want to be connected to the fire in any way. So she turned to her youngest daughter, Terry, who was 16 years old at the time. Theresa told Terry exactly what to do. Wait until the middle of the night. Pour lighter fluid on the floors, light a match, and leave. Terry was terrified. She had already witnessed her mother murder 2 of her sisters. She had helped cover it up, She had lived in constant fear for years, but she also knew that refusing her mother meant death. So, in the middle of the night, Terry poured 3 containers of lighter fluid across the apartment floors. She struck a match, watched the flames spread, and ran. But the plan failed. Neighbors saw the smoke, called 911. Firefighters arrived within minutes and extinguished the blaze. The fire had damaged parts of the apartment, but the closet where Sheila died was barely touched. The evidence remained. But by the time investigators could follow up, Theresa was already gone. In 1988, Theresa Knorr left Sacramento. She packed her belongings, changed her name, and moved to Sandy, Utah. She found work as a live-in caregiver for an elderly couple. She presented herself as a kind, caring woman, someone who had experienced hardship but was trying to rebuild her life. Her employers believed her. They welcomed her into their home, treated her like family. One of them would later tell reporters that they couldn't say a single bad thing about her. Theresa had successfully reinvented herself. She left the murders behind, started fresh, and for 5 years, she lived a quiet, unremarkable life in Sandy, Utah. No one suspected her. No one knew her past. She was just another middle-aged woman working a regular job. But there was something Theresa didn't know. Something she couldn't have predicted. Her youngest daughter, Terry, also lived in Sandy, Utah. Terry had moved there years earlier, trying to escape the trauma of her childhood. She worked as a cashier at a local grocery store. She kept to herself, never spoke about her past, never told anyone what had happened inside that apartment in Sacramento. For years, mother and daughter lived in the same small town, shopped at the same stores, walked the same streets, and neither knew the other was there. Nearly 10 years had passed since Suesan's murder, 9 years since Sheila's death. Terry Knorr was now an adult. She had tried to move on, to forget, to bury the memories deep inside, but the trauma never left. Every night, she saw Suesan's face, heard Sheila's screams, remembered the smell of burning flesh, the sight of her mother's cold, emotionless expression as she ordered her children to commit unspeakable acts. Terry couldn't carry the secret anymore. She walked into a police station and told a detective she needed to report 2 murders. The detective asked her to explain, and Terry told him everything. The torture, the handcuffs, the accidental shooting, the bullet carved out with a box cutter. Suesan burned alive on the side of Highway 80. Sheila locked in a closet for 3 days. The bodies dumped like garbage. The fire. The years of silence. At first, the detective didn't believe her. The story was too horrific, too surreal. A mother torturing and murdering her own daughters, forcing her other children to help dispose of the bodies. It sounded like something out of a horror movie. But Terry knew details, specific dates, locations, names. She described the apartment, the closet, the highway where Suesan died, and slowly, the detective realized she was telling the truth. Investigators reopened the cold case files. Jane Doe, 4873. Jane Doe, 6607, 85. They compared Terry's testimony to the evidence. The timeline matched. The locations matched. They exhumed Suesan's remains and confirmed the cause of death. Burns. Smoke inhalation. Stab wounds in the back. They identified Sheila's body through dental records. Both victims had been murdered exactly as Terry described. Police searched the old apartment in Sacramento. They removed the subfloor from the closet where Sheila had died. They tested it for biological evidence. And they found traces of human remains, blood, tissue, DNA that matched Sheila Sanders. The evidence was undeniable. On November 11, 1993, a warrant was issued for Theresa Knorr's arrest. Police tracked her to Sandy, Utah, where she was still working as a caregiver. They knocked on the door, identified themselves, and placed her under arrest. Theresa was 47 years old. She had spent 5 years living under an alias, pretending to be someone else. But the past had finally caught up with her. When confronted with the evidence, Theresa confessed. She admitted to the shooting, to ordering the removal of the bullet, to ordering her sons to burn Suesan alive, to locking Sheila in the closet, to forcing Terry to set the apartment on fire. She showed no remorse, no regret. She claimed her daughters had deserved what happened to them, that they had been disobedient, ungrateful, a burden. Theresa Knorr was extradited back to California and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, and special circumstances of torture. The trial began in 1995. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence: Terry's testimony, the confessions, the forensic evidence from the apartment, the autopsy reports, the timeline of abuse and murder. Theresa's defense attorneys argued that she had been mentally ill, that years of abuse and trauma had broken her mind, that she hadn't been in control of her actions. But the prosecution countered with evidence of premeditation. Theresa had planned Suesan's murder, driven her to a remote location, ordered her sons to burn the body. She had locked Sheila in a closet for 3 days, knowing she would die. She had forced Terry to set fire to the apartment to destroy evidence. These were not the actions of someone who had lost control. These were the actions of a calculated, sadistic killer. The jury deliberated for several days. On October 17, 1995, they returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts. Theresa Knorr was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. She would spend the rest of her life in prison. As the judge read the sentence, Theresa showed no emotion, no tears, no apology. She simply stared straight ahead, expressionless, as she was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. Theresa Knorr is currently incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Chino, California. She will be eligible for parole in 2027, when she is 80 years old. But given the severity of her crimes, it is unlikely she will ever be released. Her sons, Robert and William, were granted immunity in exchange for their testimony. They had been children when the murders occurred, forced by their mother to participate in acts they didn't understand and couldn't refuse. Today, they live under new identities, trying to rebuild their lives away from the shadow of their mother's crimes. Terry Knorr, the daughter who finally spoke up, has largely stayed out of the public eye. She gave interviews in the years following the trial, describing the horror of her childhood and the courage it took to come forward. But eventually, she stepped back from the spotlight, choosing privacy over publicity. The trauma of what she witnessed, what she survived, will never fully leave her. Suesan Knorr was 17 years old when she died. She spent the last 2 years of her life chained under a dining room table. She was accidentally shot by her terrified younger sister, had a bullet carved out of her back with a box cutter and kitchen knife, and was burned alive on the side of Highway 80. Her body lay unidentified for 9 years before anyone knew her name. Sheila Sanders was 20 years old. She died of dehydration and starvation inside a broom closet. Her body was discarded in a cardboard box near an airport. She remained Jane Doe, 60785, until her sister found the courage to tell the truth. The apartment in Sacramento where the crimes occurred no longer exists. The building has been demolished, the street has changed, but the story remains. A reminder that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a mother. Sometimes it lives inside the place you're supposed to feel safest. And sometimes the person you should trust most is the one who hurts you the most. This was the real story of the Theresa Knorr house. What they didn't tell you about America's most evil mother.